The silence. In the dimly lit detention cell, Kodo sat with a stoic demeanor, his mind grappling with the weight of his circumstances. The cold, unyielding walls that surrounded him seemed to close in with each passing moment, the silence only broken by the distant echoes of footsteps in the corridors. Despite the harsh reality of his situation, a flicker of optimism burned within him, a steadfast belief in his innocence and an unwavering determination to prove it. Kodo had always been a man of resolve, and even in the depths of despair, he clung to the hope that justice would prevail. But the reality was stark. He was imprisoned, accused of a crime that cut him to the core, the assassination of his own father, President Natsu. The world outside seemed a distant memory, and the confines of his cell, though suffocating, had become a place where he could retreat into his thoughts, trying to piece together the events that had led him here. The accusations against him were severe, and the evidence seemed damning, yet Kodo knew in his heart that he had been framed, caught in a web of deceit that he could not yet unravel. As he sat in quiet contemplation, Kodo's thoughts inevitably drifted to Durika, the one person who had stood by him through everything, the woman who had been his solace and strength. The thought of her brought a warmth to his heart, even in the cold darkness of his cell. He knew that she was out there, fighting for him, believing in him when no one else would. It was that belief, that unshakable love, that kept him going. Meanwhile, outside the confines of the detention center, Durika paced nervously, her heart weighed down by the burden of her love for Kodo. The bustling city around her seemed oblivious to the turmoil that raged within her, the world moving on while her own life had been thrown into chaos. Each step she took echoed the tumultuous rhythm of her emotions, a symphony of love, fear, and determination. Kodo was not just a part of her life, he was her life itself, and the thought of him languishing behind bars gnawed at her soul. Durika had always been a woman of action, someone who refused to be a passive observer in her own life. She had watched as the man she loved was taken from her, accused of a crime she knew he could never commit. The injustice of it all fueled a fire within her, a fire that had been smoldering ever since Kodo's arrest. She could not stand by and do nothing. She had to act, to find a way to help him, to prove his innocence. As Durika pondered her next move, a bold idea sparked within her, a daring plan that would test the limits of her resolve and the depth of her love for Kodo. It was a plan fraught with risk, but she knew that she could not live with herself if she didn't try. She had always believed that love could conquer all, and now, more than ever, she was determined to put that belief to the test. With newfound determination, Durika made her way to the detention center, her heart pounding with anticipation and trepidation. She had been here before, visiting Kodo, trying to lift his spirits and reassure him that they would find a way out of this nightmare. But this time was different. This time, she was not just coming to offer words of comfort, she was coming with a plan, a way to get Kodo out of this hellish place. The detention center loomed before her, a grim reminder of the harsh reality that had torn them apart. The guards at the entrance recognized her, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and wariness. Durika had become a regular visitor, her presence a constant in Kodo's otherwise isolated existence. She nodded at the guards as she passed, her mind focused on the task ahead. Upon reaching Kodo's cell, Durika found herself face to face with the man she loved, his presence a balm to her troubled soul. Despite the grim surroundings, Kodo's eyes shone with genuine happiness at the sight of her. In that moment, the walls of the cell seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, bound together by a love that transcended the darkness that surrounded them. "Kodo," Durika whispered, her voice soft yet filled with emotion. "I've been thinking. I can't just sit by and watch you suffer like this. There has to be a way to get you out of here." Kodo's brow knitted with worry at Durika's bold declaration, his instincts sounding an alarm about the dangers that lay ahead. He knew Durika well enough to recognize the determination in her eyes, but he also understood the risks tied to whatever she was planning. "Durika, you must not take any reckless actions," he cautioned, his voice laced with concern. "I deeply value your love and willingness to help, but I can't bear the thought of you putting yourself in danger." Despite Kodo's apprehension, Durika's resolve remained firm, unwavering in the face of his concern. A heart divided. Durika left the detention center with a heavy heart, the cold evening air biting at her skin as she walked away from the place that now held her entire world captive. Each step felt like a betrayal, her feet moving forward while her heart remained tethered to the man she loved, locked away behind steel bars. The weight of the decision she was about to make bore down on her with every breath, each one more painful than the last. Kodo had been her anchor, her constant, the person who had always been there for her through every storm life had thrown their way. From the moment they met, Durika knew that her heart belonged to him. There was something in the way he looked at her, a depth of understanding and affection that made her feel truly seen, truly loved. Kodo was not just a lover to her, he was a partner, a confidant, a soulmate. The thought of losing him was unbearable, like a piece of her own soul being ripped away. But now, as she walked through the darkened streets, her heart felt as though it was being torn in two. The reality of Kodo's situation was inescapable. He was imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit, and the forces that had conspired to put him there were powerful and relentless. Durika had spent countless nights agonizing over how to save him, how to prove his innocence, but every path she considered seemed to lead to a dead end. The world outside the detention center moved on, oblivious to the turmoil that consumed her. The city's lights glittered in the distance, a stark contrast to the darkness that had settled over her heart. People went about their lives, unaware that Durika's life had come to a standstill, caught in the vice-like grip of fear and helplessness. She felt as though she was drowning, each breath a struggle against the crushing weight of her emotions. In the silence of the night, Durika's thoughts were filled with memories of Kodo. She could see his smile, hear his laugh, feel the warmth of his embrace. She remembered the way he would look at her, his eyes filled with love and admiration, as though she were the most important person in the world to him. In those moments, nothing else mattered. They had faced so many challenges together, and through it all, their love had only grown stronger. But now, that love was being tested in ways she had never imagined. The thought of Kodo sitting alone in that cold, dark cell, cut off from the world, filled her with a deep, aching sorrow. She could only imagine the loneliness he must feel, the fear that must be gnawing at him. And what hurt most of all was knowing that she couldn't be there with him, couldn't hold him, couldn't tell him that everything would be okay. Durika knew that Kodo was strong, that he would never give up, even in the face of such overwhelming odds. But she also knew that he needed her, now more than ever. He needed to know that she was fighting for him, that she believed in him, that she would do whatever it took to bring him home. Yet, as determined as she was to save him, Durika felt the crushing weight of her own helplessness. She had always been a woman of action, someone who could find a solution to any problem, but this was different. This was beyond her control. The only option left to her was one that filled her with dread. She knew what she had to do, but the thought of it made her heart clench with pain. There was one person who had the power to free Kodo, one person who could cut through the web of lies and deceit that had ensnared him. But turning to that person meant making a choice that could destroy the very foundation of her love for Kodo. Ruta. Durika understood how much Ruta loved her. His love for her had always been a quiet, steady presence in the background of her life, a love that she had never fully acknowledged because of her loyalty to Kodo. Ruta had always been there, watching over her, protecting her, even when she hadn't asked for it. She had known for years how he felt, and she had done her best to keep a respectful distance, not wanting to give him false hope. But now, that very love could be the key to Kodo's freedom. The thought of it tore at her soul. How could she ask Ruta for help, knowing what it would cost? How could she betray Kodo in such a way, even if it was for his sake? Durika's love for Kodo was pure, unwavering, and the idea of compromising that love, of tainting it with the guilt of another man's affections, was almost too much to bear. Yet, the alternative was unthinkable. Kodo would remain in that cell, his life slipping away day by day, unless she did something. And Ruta, he was now the most powerful man in Gorilist, the newly elected president. If anyone could free Kodo, it was him. But Durika knew Ruta well enough to understand that his help would not come without a price. She had seen the way Ruta looked at her, the unspoken longing in his eyes, the way his voice softened whenever he spoke to her. She knew that he would do anything for her, but she also knew that in asking for his help, she would be stepping into a dangerous and uncertain territory. Ruta would want something in return: her love, her loyalty, her future. And once she crossed that line, there would be no going back. As she walked through the city, the realization of what she was about to do settled over her like a shroud. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back, determined to stay strong. This was for Kodo, she reminded herself. This was for the man she loved. But the thought did little to ease the pain that was ripping through her heart. Durika knew that if she went to Ruta, it would change everything. Her love for Kodo would be forever tainted by the knowledge of what she had done. Even if Kodo were freed, even if they could be together again, she would always carry the burden of this decision, the guilt of knowing that she had sacrificed something precious in order to save him. And what of Kodo? How would he feel if he ever found out? Would he understand, or would he see it as a betrayal? Durika's heart twisted at the thought. Kodo was a man of honor, a man who believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. How could she reconcile that with what she was about to do? How could she ask for his forgiveness when she herself wasn't sure she could forgive what she was about to do? But there was no other way. Durika knew this with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. If she wanted to save Kodo, she had to go to Ruta. She had to make the sacrifice, even if it meant losing a part of herself in the process. The tears came then, hot and silent, slipping down her cheeks as she walked through the deserted streets. The city lights blurred in her vision, the world around her fading into the background as she was consumed by her grief. She felt as though she were walking towards her own execution, each step taking her closer to a future she didn't want but couldn't avoid. Durika's love for Kodo was the strongest force in her life, and yet now, it was that very love that was leading her to a decision that could destroy them both. She had always believed that their love could conquer anything, that it was unbreakable, unshakable. But now, as she faced the reality of what she had to do, she wasn't so sure. The pain in her chest was almost unbearable, a physical ache that made it hard to breathe. She wanted nothing more than to turn back, to run to Kodo's side and tell him that everything would be all right, that they would find another way. But she couldn't lie to herself. There was no other way. This was the only path left to her, and she had to walk it, no matter how much it hurt. As Durika continued on her path, the tears continued to fall, each one a testament to the love she had for Kodo and the sacrifice she was about to make. She knew that she would never be the same after this, that her heart would bear the scars of this decision for the rest of her life. But she also knew that she would do anything for Kodo, even if it meant destroying her own happiness in the process. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, and the future she had once dreamed of with Kodo now seemed like a distant memory. But Durika was resolved. She would do what needed to be done, even if it meant losing everything she held dear. Because in the end, her love for Kodo was worth any sacrifice, even this one. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind filled with sorrow, Durika steeled herself for the path ahead. The love she had for Kodo would guide her through the darkness, even if it meant walking into the arms of a man she didn't love, to save the one she did. The price of freedom. As Durika arrived at the grandiose presidential palace, her heart weighed heavy with trepidation and uncertainty. The opulent halls, adorned with symbols of power and history, felt both imposing and surreal. The soft glow of chandeliers cast long shadows on the polished marble floors, and the silence that filled the space was thick with anticipation. Each step she took echoed the gravity of her mission, the sound a haunting reminder of the choice she was about to make. This was her first visit to the seat of power, and the significance of her purpose bore down upon her shoulders like an invisible burden. The palace was a world apart from the one she knew, a place where decisions that shaped the fate of nations were made, where power and influence coalesced into a single, overwhelming force. And now, she was here, not as a visitor or a guest, but as a woman on a mission that could change her life forever. Ruta, the newly elected president, awaited Durika's arrival with a sense of anticipation tinged with unease. He had prepared for this moment, knowing that Durika would come to him, seeking his help for Kodo. The thought of seeing her again filled him with a mixture of joy and anxiety. Outwardly, he maintained the composure befitting a man of his station, but inside, a storm of conflicting emotions raged. As the door to his private office opened and Durika stepped into the room, Ruta's heart skipped a beat. She was as beautiful as ever, her presence both calming and unsettling. But as he looked closer, he saw the strain in her features, the forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Something was wrong, and Ruta's keen intuition sensed the storm brewing beneath her composed facade. With practiced politeness, Ruta extended a warm welcome to Durika, his eyes searching hers for any hint of the turmoil that lay hidden within. Durika, he greeted her, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of emotion. It's been too long. Please, come in. Durika managed a small nod, stepping further into the room. The grandeur of the space was lost on her. All she could think about was the reason she was here, the impossible choice she was about to make. The walls, adorned with portraits of past leaders, seemed to close in on her, the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Ruta gestured for her to sit, but Durika hesitated, her composure faltering as she struggled to find the words. She felt as though she were drowning in her own emotions, the fear, the desperation, the guilt, all threatening to overwhelm her. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision as the weight of her plea bore down upon her. Sensing Durika's distress, Ruta's initial delight gave way to concern. He stepped closer, his voice softening as he reached out a comforting hand. If there's anything troubling you, Durika, please, speak freely, he urged, his gaze gentle yet probing. Durika's heart ached at the kindness in his voice, knowing that what she was about to ask would change everything between them. She took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady herself. Ruta, she began, her voice trembling with the effort to keep her emotions in check. I'm here because I need your help. It's Kodo. He's innocent, Ruta. You know he's innocent. But he's been framed, and if something isn't done soon, he'll be lost forever. Ruta listened in silence, his heart torn between compassion for Durika's suffering and the weight of his own feelings. He had known this moment would come, but hearing the desperation in her voice, seeing the tears in her eyes, made it all the more real, all the more painful. Durika, Ruta said gently, his hand still resting on hers. I know how much Kodo means to you, and I want to help. But you must understand, the situation is complicated. The charges against him are serious, and there are forces at play that even I cannot easily counter. Durika looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, Ruta. I'm begging you. You're the only one who can save him. You're the president now. You have the power to set him free. Ruta's heart ached at her plea, the depth of her love for Kodo evident in every word, every tear that fell. He had always known that she loved Kodo, but hearing her speak of that love so openly, so desperately, was like a knife twisting in his chest. He wanted to be the one she turned to, the one she loved with such intensity. But he wasn't Kodo, and that realization filled him with a deep, painful longing. For a moment, Ruta said nothing, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. He wanted to help her, to grant her request, but he also knew that doing so would mean giving up the one chance he had to win her love. It was an impossible choice, one that tore at the very fabric of his being. Finally, Ruta spoke, his voice tinged with both resolve and sorrow. Durika, he said quietly, his eyes locking onto hers, I can help Kodo. I can use my influence to clear his name and secure his release. But there's something I need to ask of you in return. Durika's heart skipped a beat, a cold dread settling in her chest. She knew what was coming, but hearing it from Ruta's lips made it all the more real, all the more terrifying. What do you mean? She asked, her voice shaking. Ruta took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to say. I've loved you for a long time, Durika, he confessed, his voice filled with emotion. I've loved you since we were young, and that love has only grown stronger over the years. I've watched you and Kodo together, and I've always respected your choice. But now, things have changed. I'm not asking you to betray your love for him, but I want you to consider a future with me. Durika felt the ground shift beneath her feet, the weight of his words crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Ruta, I don't know what to say, she stammered, her mind reeling. Kodo is my world. I love him more than anything. Ruta's expression softened, his heart aching at the sight of her turmoil. I know, he said gently, and I don't want to take that away from you. But I also can't ignore how I feel. I want to be with you, Durika. I want to protect you, to build a life with you. If you can give me that chance, I'll do everything in my power to help Kodo. I'll make sure he's safe, that he's free to live his life. But I need to know that you'll be with me. Durika's world spun out of control, the room closing in around her as Ruta's words echoed in her mind. The choice before her was unbearable, a choice between the man she loved with every fiber of her being and the man who could save him. How could she choose? How could she turn her back on Kodo, the man who had been her everything, for a future with Ruta? And yet, the image of Kodo trapped in that cold, dark cell haunted her. If she didn't do this, if she didn't agree to Ruta's terms, Kodo would remain there, his life slipping away day by day. She couldn't live with that. She couldn't let Kodo suffer when there was something she could do to save him. With tears streaming down her cheeks, Durika felt her heart shatter into a million pieces. Her voice trembled as she spoke, her words barely audible through the pain that gripped her. I'll do it, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'll be with you, Ruta. I'll give you what you want. Just promise me you'll help Kodo. Promise me you'll set him free. Ruta's heart soared with a mixture of triumph and guilt, his emotions a whirlwind of conflicting desires. He had secured her commitment, but at what cost? The sight of her tear-streaked face, the sound of her voice breaking with sorrow, tore at him. He had won her, but the victory felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge of what he was asking her to sacrifice. I promise, Ruta said softly, his voice filled with both conviction and regret. I'll do everything in my power to free Kodo. You have my word. Durika nodded, her heart breaking with each passing moment. The weight of her decision settled over her like a heavy shroud, suffocating her with the knowledge that she had chosen to sever the most important bond in her life for the sake of the man she loved. Her love for Kodo had been the silent undercurrent of her life, and now, as she acquiesced to Ruta's demands, a profound sadness enveloped her, threatening to consume her from within. As Durika turned to leave, the reality of what she had agreed to began to sink in. She had sacrificed her own happiness, her own heart, to save Kodo. But at what cost? The future she had once dreamed of with Kodo now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a future that was uncertain and filled with pain. Ruta watched her go, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he had done. He had won Durika, but he had also broken her, and that realization filled him with a deep, lingering regret. As the door closed behind her, Ruta was left alone in the grand room, the silence oppressive, the victory bittersweet. The echoes of Durika's tearful acceptance reverberated through the grand halls of the presidential palace, a haunting reminder of the complex and challenging path that lay ahead for all involved. Love, duty, and sacrifice intertwined in a delicate dance, shaping the destinies of those caught in its embrace. And amidst the opulence and grandeur, the silent whispers of the heart echoed louder than any proclamation of power or authority. Shattered bonds. The dimly lit corridors of the detention center stood witness to an unexpected intrusion as Ruta's formidable presence sent shockwaves through the otherwise somber atmosphere. The air crackled with tension as he made his way through the labyrinthine corridors, his footsteps echoing with purpose. Guards straightened as he passed, their eyes wide with a mixture of respect and fear, for they knew that the newly elected president was not a man to be trifled with. Inside his cold, cramped cell, Kodo felt the air change, as though the very walls were closing in on him. The sudden commotion outside filled him with a sense of foreboding, a gut instinct telling him that something was terribly wrong. He stood up, his muscles tense, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The sound of heavy footsteps grew louder, and Kodo's heart pounded in his chest as he braced himself for whatever was to come. When Ruta's figure finally loomed into view, Kodo felt a shiver run down his spine. The sight of the man who had orchestrated his downfall, who now stood as the most powerful figure in Gorillist, filled Kodo with a fierce, burning resentment. His hands clenched into fists as he stared back at Ruda, his eyes blazing with defiance. There was no fear in Kodo's gaze, only a deep-seated rage that simmered beneath the surface. Their eyes met in a silent exchange that spoke volumes. The animosity between them was palpable, the air thick with the unspoken hatred that had festered between them for so long. Ruda's expression was one of cold calculation, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips as he reveled in the power he now held over Kodo. "Do you know why I came here?" Ruda's deep voice pierced through the silence like a dagger, each word sharp and deliberate, cutting through the tension with chilling precision. Kodo's response was a stoic silence, his jaw clenched in a display of stubborn resolve. He refused to dignify Ruda's question with a response, knowing that whatever he said would only serve to fuel the fire of Ruda's manipulative schemes. His silence was his only weapon, and he wielded it with the same determination that had kept him alive this long. But Ruda was undeterred by Kodo's silence. He took a step closer, his smirk widening as he looked down at the man he had defeated. "You will be free within the next 7 days, he announced, his voice laced with a cruel amusement. "All investigations against you will be suspended. I have issued an amnesty." Kodo's eyes narrowed as he processed Ruda's words. The implications hung in the air like a heavy fog, casting a shadow of uncertainty over Kodo's already tumultuous existence. He braced himself for the blow that he knew was coming, his muscles tensing in anticipation. "But why did I do that?" Ruda continued, his voice dripping with malice as he leaned in closer, relishing in Kodo's captive audience. The smirk on his face deepened as he prepared to deliver the final, crushing blow. "I'll tell you. Durika asked for you to live, not for your body to rot in prison for killing the president." Kodo's breath caught in his throat at the mention of Durika's name. A flicker of hope ignited within him, but it was quickly extinguished as Ruda's next words cut through the air like a blade. "Durika now belongs to me," Ruda declared, his voice filled with a twisted satisfaction. "The wedding ceremony will be held in the next 30 days. The weight of Ruda's words landed like a hammer blow, shattering the fragile semblance of hope that Kodo had clung to amidst the darkness of his confinement. His vision blurred as the world around him tilted, the enormity of what Ruda had just said crashing down on him with devastating force. The image of Durika, the woman he loved more than anything, standing beside Ruda as his bride, was more than Kodo could bear. Anguish and rage churned within him, a tempest of emotions threatening to consume him whole. His hands shook with the intensity of his fury, his chest heaving as he struggled to contain the raw, primal scream that clawed its way up from the depths of his soul. And then, in a sudden explosion of fury, Kodo's scream tore through the corridors of the detention center, reverberating with an intensity that shook the very foundations of the building. The sound was deafening, filled with all the pain, all the rage, all the despair that had built up inside him since the moment of his arrest. Guards stumbled back in shock, their ears ringing from the sheer force of Kodo's anguish. Blood trickled from ruptured eardrums as they clutched their heads, trying to block out the sound that threatened to drive them mad. But even as Kodo unleashed his fury, a bitter realization settled over him like a suffocating blanket. Against Ruda's calculated resolve and manipulative machinations, his rage seemed futile, a mere drop in the ocean of power that Ruda wielded with ruthless efficiency. The man before him was untouchable, his victory complete, and Kodo was left to drown in the hopelessness of his defeat. As the echoes of Kodo's roar faded into the cold silence of the detention center, Ruda remained unmoved, his smirk never faltering. He had expected this reaction, had even relished the thought of it. For in Kodo's pain, Ruda found his own twisted sense of triumph. With a final, contemptuous glance, Ruda turned away, his footsteps echoing in the now eerily silent corridor. He didn't need to say anything more. The damage had been done, the message delivered. He had taken everything from Kodo, his freedom, his love, his future. And now, he would walk away, leaving Kodo to grapple with the shadows of pain and despair that now enveloped him. Kodo slumped to the ground, his strength drained, his spirit shattered. The man who had once been unbreakable now felt the weight of the world crushing him from all sides. Durika was lost to him, claimed by the very man who had orchestrated his downfall, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The love that had once been his salvation was now the source of his deepest agony. As the darkness closed in around him, Kodo realized that this was a battle he could not win. Ruda had outmaneuvered him at every turn, and now, the life Kodo had fought so hard to protect was slipping through his fingers like sand. All that remained was the cold, hard truth: he had lost everything, and there was no way to get it back. The silence of the detention center pressed down on Kodo like a suffocating blanket, the echoes of his screams still lingering in the air. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the emptiness that now filled him. And as Kodo sat alone in the darkness, the weight of his loss pressed down on him like a crushing wave, threatening to drown him in the depths of his despair. The future that had once seemed so bright now lay in ruins, shattered by the man who had taken everything from him. And the love that had once been his guiding light was now nothing more than a distant memory, lost in the shadows of a world that had betrayed him. In that moment, as the walls of his cell closed in around him, Kodo knew that his life would never be the same. The world had moved on without him, and the only thing left for him now was the cold, empty silence of his own broken heart. Beneath the surface, as Kodo prepared to leave the detention center following the unexpected turn of events, a glimmer of hope pierced through the darkness that had shrouded his existence. The presidential pardon offered a lifeline, a chance to reclaim his freedom and clear his tarnished name. But even as relief washed over him, another, darker thought gnawed at the edges of his mind. The circumstances surrounding his release, and the way Ruda had manipulated the situation, left Kodo with an unsettling suspicion. Could this all have been orchestrated from the start? Kodo's thoughts were consumed by the idea that Ruda had plotted every twist and turn, not just to bring him down, but to take Durika from him. The more Kodo considered it, the more everything seemed to fit into place. The assassination of President Natsu, the swift rise of Ruda to power, and now this sudden offer of freedom, everything pointed to a calculated move by a man who had always coveted what Kodo held dear. As he was about to step out of the cell that had confined him for so long, Kodo's thoughts were interrupted by the voice of a guard. "The investigator wants to see you before you go," the guard said, his tone neutral but firm. A sense of foreboding gripped Kodo, but he nodded and followed the guard through the winding corridors of the detention center. The walls, which had once felt suffocating, now seemed like they were holding secrets that Kodo was desperate to uncover. When Kodo entered the investigator's office, the air was thick with tension. The investigator, a man of stern countenance and sharp eyes, regarded Kodo with a measured gaze, his expression betraying little of his thoughts. "I understand you have some questions about the presidential pardon," the investigator began, his voice steady and calm, cutting through the silence that hung between them. Kodo nodded, but before he could address the pardon, a different urgency overtook him. There was something he needed to know, something that had been gnawing at him since the moment of his arrest. "Yes," Kodo replied, his tone serious, "but before we discuss that, I have a favor to ask." The investigator raised an eyebrow, intrigued by Kodo's unexpected request. "Tell me," he prompted, his curiosity piqued by the sudden shift in the conversation. Kodo took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I want to retrieve the machete that Jess intended to kill President Natsu with," he stated, his voice carrying a weight that caught the investigator's full attention. The request hung in the air, heavy with implications. The investigator frowned slightly, processing Kodo's words with thoughtful deliberation. He knew the significance of that machete. It was a key piece of evidence in the investigation. Yet, with the investigation now closed and the pardon granted, there was little reason not to grant Kodo's request. After a moment of silence, the investigator nodded, his decision made. "I'll arrange for the machete to be retrieved from the evidence warehouse," he agreed, his voice laced with a note of caution. "But what do you plan to do with it?" Kodo's eyes darkened with resolve. "It's the key to uncovering the truth," he said, his voice low but firm. "There are things I need to understand, and that machete might hold the answers." The investigator studied Kodo for a long moment, sensing the depth of his determination. He nodded again, this time with a hint of respect. "I'll make sure it's done," he promised. Gratitude washed over Kodo, but it was tempered by the growing suspicion that Ruta's hand was behind everything that had happened. He left the investigator's office with a renewed sense of purpose, clutching onto the hope that the machete could help him unravel the web of lies that had entangled his life. Returning home after his release, Kodo walked through the quiet streets, each step carrying him closer to the resolution he sought. The night was still, the air cool, as the moon cast a pale glow over the city. The weight of the machete's impending retrieval hung heavy in his mind, a silent vow etched in his heart. As Kodo approached his doorstep, a sense of calm washed over him, a prelude to the storm that awaited him. He unlocked the door and stepped into the familiarity of his home, greeted by the comforting embrace of solitude. But even here, in the place that had once been his sanctuary, the echoes of his suspicions lingered. Making his way to the modest study tucked away in the corner of his residence, Kodo retrieved a worn journal from the shelf, a repository of memories, thoughts, and aspirations that had guided him through the darkest of times. As he flipped through its withered pages, his mind drifted to the events that had led him to this moment, the betrayal, the accusations, and the relentless pursuit of truth amidst a sea of lies. And through it all, one thought kept surfacing: Ruta. Kodo had always respected Ruta, even admired him in some ways. But now, all he could see was a man who had schemed and manipulated his way to the top, using Kodo as a pawn in his twisted game. The idea that Ruta had orchestrated the assassination of President Natsu just to take Durika from him seemed both horrifying and plausible. With deliberate movements, Kodo retrieved a shovel from the storage closet, his hand steady with determination. Venturing into the backyard, illuminated by the soft glow of the moon, he found a secluded spot beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree, a silent witness to the passage of time. Positioning the shovel against the soft earth, Kodo began to dig, each scoop bringing him closer to his objective. The rhythmic sound of the shovel biting into the soil echoed through the stillness of the night, a testament to Kodo's unwavering resolve. As the hole deepened, Kodo's thoughts returned to Ruta's words in the detention center, the way he had announced his marriage to Durika with such cold finality. The very idea made Kodo's blood boil. Had Ruta planned it all from the start? Had he seen Kodo's love for Durika and decided to take it for himself, no matter the cost? When the shovel finally hit the right depth, Kodo paused, his breath coming in slow, controlled bursts. The suspicion that had taken root in his mind now felt almost like certainty. Ruta had killed President Natsu, Kodo was convinced of it. And the machete was the key to proving it. With careful hands, Kodo buried the machete and stood back, looking down at the freshly turned earth. He made a silent vow to the machete, now buried beneath the soil. "I will see you again soon," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet determination. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. The burial marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Kodo steeled himself for the challenges that lay ahead. He knew that if Ruta had orchestrated the assassination, then the new president would stop at nothing to keep that secret buried. But Kodo was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As he stood alone in the moonlit yard, the night air cool against his skin, Kodo's resolve hardened. He would not let Ruta get away with this. The machete, once wielded in treachery, had become a symbol of determination and resilience in Kodo's hands. The game had changed, but Kodo was still in it. And as long as he had breath in his body, he would fight for justice, not just for himself, but for President Natsu, for Durika, and for the truth that had been buried beneath lies and deceit. Kodo turned and walked back towards the house, leaving the buried machete behind. But he knew it would not stay there forever. One day, he would return to that spot, and when he did, he would be ready to bring the truth to light. A new adventure awaited, and Kodo was ready to face it, whatever it took. The battle was far from over, and Kodo was determined to win it.